I want to introduce you to our keynote speakers for today. Dave Coleman is the co-founder of Cooler Projects CIC, who deliver the Carbon Literacy Project on behalf of the Carbon Literacy Trust. Dave's initial career was in IT before working as a management trainer and coach in the commercial sector. After spending 6 years on the board of the Friends of the Earth, he chaired the energy writing group of Manchester, A Certain Future, and now sits on its steering group, chairing the Low Carbon Culture AIM. Dave is an experienced public speaker and advocate, appearing widely on BBC TV, radio, ITV, Channel 4 and Sky, as well as regional and national press. Recent work has included management consultancy, advising a corporate on product sustainability, developing a feasibility study for a sustainable business network, leading the Carbon Literacy Project, and general advocacy, advisory and chairing work. Lynsey Jones joins us as the Museum Development Officer in the Northwest and has worked in the museums and galleries sector for over 20 years, with experience as a curator and collections manager for local authority, independent and national museums. She's worked for the National Football Museum, Yorkshire Museums, Libraries and Archives Council and the Harris Museum and Art Gallery. She has a specific interest in museums and environmental sustainability and is a certified carbon literacy trainer. This morning, they join us to explain more about the Carbon Literacy Project and the exciting opportunities it offers museums to train their own staff and volunteers to become carbon literate and to deliver learning programmes in their communities. So I now hand over to Dave and Lynsey to launch the second day of our conference.
Good morning. My name's Dave Coleman. I wasn't expecting such a fulsome biography, so you already know far more about me than I was expecting. But I'm here because I'm the co-founder and the managing director of the Carbon Literacy Project, and I've been asked to do a keynote address at the start of today. I'm not one for huge, pretentious keynote speeches, so I thought I would chat to you for a little while and share some thoughts. We're going to talk about carbon literacy, and we'll look at how that might help you in the museum and heritage sector. But I thought I'd talk about art and culture and what the culture sector does and relate that to dealing with the climate emergency. I'm no expert on the culture sector. I don't come from a museums background. That's not my expertise. So please accept my apologies if I unintentionally patronize you with suggestions for things that you are already doing, because I can see there's already some great work going on just from the talks and events that were delivered yesterday. But if I'm clumsy in my expression, please forgive me for that. However, although I'm not an expert on the culture sector, I'm an avid consumer of culture. I'm very interested in visual arts. I visit galleries. You'll be pleased, as I'm sure you have membership schemes, to know I'm a member of lots of different museums. The Tate, Manchester Art Gallery, the Galleries of Scotland. And wherever I go, I look at particularly visual arts because I'm interested in it. And therefore, it's something that has struck me a number of times that the purpose of art is to educate, to stimulate, to challenge, to make us think in different ways. And therefore, I often look at art and think, well, what's the relationship between culture and dealing with climate change? And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Carbon literacy is a low carbon culture change project. That's what we refer to it as. And organizations approach us because they want to use carbon literacy to help them address their response as an organization to climate change and the climate emergency. So very often they approach us and say, well, you know, what should we do? We do some work with them, which we'll come to help them on their journey. So the first place they tend to look is the obvious one. It's within the fence line, if I can call it that. It's within the building. So if an organization approaches us and says, we want to deal with the climate emergency, they tend to look at, well, what do we do as an organization? What are our fuel bills? What kind of energy do we buy? Do we use plastic straws in our cafe? And they look at the things that they do that they've got direct control of and that are very obvious to them. And the things that they can change most easily. And that's the same, not just for a museum or an art gallery, but for all organizations. And those are the obvious things. And we do sometimes get organizations coming to us saying, well, you know, we've changed our energy supplier, we print less, we've got rid of the plastic cups. Is that it? Clearly it isn't. Because most organizations, the vast majority of organizations' ability to change and achieve change isn't within the fence line of their own building or their own immediate property. it's because of the things that they do and the big opportunities outside the fence line. So it's the products that they sell, the service that they offer. And therefore, I have no doubt that you, as organizations working in the culture sector, recognize that your big opportunity is not just within the organization, but in the places that you engage with other people. So clearly that means the people who come and visit you, but also it means the audiences that you address in other ways, your stakeholders, the local authority that's responsible for the premises where you operate, the suppliers that you buy your supplies from, the organizations that you interact with professionally, and your ability to change and affect low carbon change and lead that change is within your fence line, but there is a much greater opportunity outside the fence line. But we encourage organizations to look at the product and service they sell. So what's the product and service? Clearly for you, it is culture. It is the artifacts that you retain and curate. It's the exhibitions you hold. It's the events that you put on where you engage with the public. And for the culture sector of all sectors, that's where the big opportunity is in order to achieve change and educate and activate and help us all as a society deal with climate change and deal with the climate emergency. So, and I have a personal hobby horse here, why is it that visual arts has engaged so poorly with climate change? When we look at culture in particular, culture tends to interact with the things which are going on in society. And we have fantastic examples of culture dealing with gender, dealing with poverty, dealing with, this year of all years, Black Lives Matters and issues of ethnicity and racism. All of the cutting edge issues that we as a society are trying to address get addressed through our popular culture, our popular and our high culture. So why is climate change often so poorly served? I work in the climate change sector, and I can scarcely think of a good example of arts engaging in a really deep way with climate change as an issue. So why is that? I have no answer other than climate change is a difficult issue to get to grips with. So the challenge is to you as a cultural sector, how can you use the resources that you have to engage people more deeply and more effectively with climate change? And that might be by curating the artifacts that you have and using them to communicate. And I know that's something that attendees at the conference are aware of. I was looking at some of the sessions yesterday about using natural science to communicate climate change, using archaeology to communicate climate change. But it's also important that we not just use the artifacts that we retain, but our opportunities to affect and use our communication, our poetry, our visuals, our visual arts, our painting, plays, whatever it might be, to engage with surely the most pressing issue for us as a society, the existential threat of climate change. So I would encourage you to look for ways to do this. A health warning. There's one thing that's worse than not communicating about climate change in a cultural sense, and it's by communicating about it badly. And I can give you a long list of very bad attempts to deal with climate change, particularly in the visual arts. If I see another example of dystopian futures with towns and cities with skyscrapers flooded halfway up and doomed communities of the future, my head will explode. It's been done. It's lazy. It's a meme. And actually, it's probably unhelpful in terms of dealing with the climate emergency. Within carbon literacy, we look at the psychology of what causes people to do things differently. And simply giving them frightening, doomy messages, we know is counterproductive. People tend to switch off and think, I don't want to know about that. La, 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 la. I'm going to continue with life as it is now. And it actually means that people are less likely to act positively on the climate emergency than if we hadn't engaged with them at all. And I can give you legion examples of very poor engagement using the arts, which has actually been counterproductive, including some that are going on at the moment. So I was having a mental rant about this as I was preparing the notes for this chat I was about to have with you. And in order to distract myself from work, I picked up a magazine and started to read it. And of course, then proved myself wrong. So I'm going to hold this up so hopefully you can see it to the camera. You may recognize this. This is Tate, etc. It's the membership magazine, if you're a member of the Tate. And I wasn't fibbing when I said I was a member of the Tate. So this is this month's issue, and I just happened to pick it up. And sure enough, on page 90, there's an article here. It's written by Helen Macdonald. You may know the name Helen Macdonald. She wrote the book H is for Hawk, a very best-selling book on nature. And she talks about a painting called Thermal by Peter Lanyon. It's actually that painting that I was holding up right now. I'm trying to get the image high enough so that you can actually see that. It was painted in 1960, and appropriately enough, it's actually in the Tate St. Ives collection. It's a painting about thermals because the artist was a glider pilot. And he was trying to express in that painting the chaotic, invisible nature of moving air that he found as a glider pilot. He tried to find thermals. And Helen Macdonald has taken that painting and used that invisible energy and the movement of thermals as a metaphor for the flows and complexity of the natural world and climate change. And therefore has taken an artistic work and used it to stimulate thinking about climate change and the climate emergency. That's really good climate art. That's using arts and culture to challenge us and make us think about the world in a different way. So whilst I might be doomy and gloomy about the culture that's happened so far, there are some excellent examples. And in the last 12 months, we've seen increasing numbers of really good opportunities to engage and really good engagement. So it's far from impossible. And I would encourage you to look at your own collections and think about what you do within the fence line as an organization, outside the fence line as an organization in the conventional way, but above all, using culture to help us address the climate emergency. So if you're going to do that, you need to bring your people with you. You need to have your organization, I would argue, on board. It's not about just the person who puts together the exhibition or the building manager who organizes the electricity supplier. We engage with organizations because they say, yeah, we need everybody on board with this. You know, how the heck do we do it? And you won't be the first organizations to think, well, how do we bring our people along with us? This was a question we started to grapple with in Manchester, which is where I'm based and where Lynsey is based. We started to grapple with this question, actually frighteningly, about 10 years ago now. And my organization, Cooler, and my co-founder, Phil Corbell, and I pulled together a working group of 30 people drawn from all walks of life, business, public sector, private sector, cultural, people from the council, community activists, all sorts of people, to say, what the heck do we need to do to try and get everybody on board, everybody in society, in organizations, outside? Is there anything that we could do to just get everybody active? So that working group of 30 people came up with a concept in response to the term carbon literacy, because we kept saying, we want people to be carbon literate. What the heck is carbon literacy? What does that term mean anyway? So we brought that group of people together in order to start to grapple with that topic. Now I'm just going to start to hopefully share screen. So somebody will hopefully shout to me and tell me if you can't see these slides. But that working group engaged with the term carbon literacy. And this is the definition that working group came up with. And this was the first time we kind of coined this term carbon literacy, and no one knew what it meant. This was the first attempt anyone made to define that term, and it's become the working definition. So if someone is carbon literate, we say they have an awareness of the carbon costs and impacts of everyday activities, and the ability and motivation to reduce emissions on an individual, community, and organizational basis. And you can imagine looking at that phrase, if you have any experience in this kind of world, the amount of workshopping that went into trying to come up with that definition and how heavily weighed every word is in that definition. Because if someone's carbon literate, they need to be aware of the carbon costs and the impacts of everyday activities. So it needs to be relevant to people immediately. But if people are aware but don't do anything differently, well, that's not very helpful. So we said if they were carbon literate, they would have the motivation to act, but also the ability, and would recognize that ability. Because if we motivate people and get them fired up to act, but they have no sense of agency and they can't see how they can make a difference, actually it becomes demotivational because they just get frustrated. So people needed to be both motivated and recognize the things that they could change. And those things that they could change needed to reduce emissions. And that needed to work individually, within our own locus of control, the things that we as individuals can do, within the communities in which we operate, the real physical communities and the virtual communities, and the organizations with which we engage. So what does carbon literacy actually mean? Well, the group then said, well, with that definition, we should have a day's worth of learning about climate change. And that's what carbon literacy is. People say, why is it a day? Well, really, we wanted a week, but there was no way that we were going to get people available in numbers to take a whole week out of their life to learn about climate change, although there was more than enough content. And it couldn't be an hour, because an hour was just too tokenistic. People didn't think about it long enough to start making changes. So everybody agreed a day's worth of learning would be about the right length. It didn't have to be a single day. It could be 2 half days. It could be a set of evening classes. It could be a couple of sessions at a weekend. It could be a visit to a museum and a workshop. It could be all sorts of things, but it needed to be a day's worth. The learning needed to be taken to where people were. It needed to have meaning to people in their daily lives immediately. It couldn't be about polar bears. If you put polar bears in your materials, we will almost certainly tell you you've got to take it out. Because again, it's a lazy meme. Polar bear equals climate change. Most people never meet polar bears. They never see them. So it's not relevant to a single mum who's got to get the kids to school and hold down a job. Polar bears are abstract. So this climate change learning had to be taken to that mum where she is now, that business leader in the business in which he worked, that hospital administrator, that doctor, whoever it was, the learning had to be relevant. Wherever possible, it needed to be delivered by peers of the learner, because we trust people like us more than any other source when it comes to learning new information. So we wanted school child to school child, solicitor to solicitor, elder to elder person, so that we trusted the source of information. And we wanted this training delivered by all of these people to each other. So no central training company. We wanted everybody to do this training and for it to be effectively crowdsourced. But there needed to be some quality control. So we wrote some requirements into a thing that became called the Carbon Literacy Standard and said, if anybody delivers training, if it meets this standard, we'll say, yep, it delivers carbon literacy. So the standard contains a few sections. It has some obvious topics. There needs to be some knowledge about climate change. So everybody gets the same basic knowledge. It might be to different levels, depending on a school child versus a research scientist, but it will still be the same key core facts and information about what is climate change, how do we know, why are we so confident, what impacts is it having, what can we do. We said some things about learning method, that people needed to formulate their own solutions to climate change. We could show them examples that other people had done, we could inspire them, and we could give them materials, but we couldn't give them a list of things to do and say, just tick down the list and choose one. People had to come up with their own solutions, not just because it engaged them with the process better, but because they would come up with better solutions than we would, because we are not experts, we are not their peers. So learning method revolves around people coming up with their own answers, and it needs to be positive and positive training and positive interaction. So not doomy, gloomy, scary climate change, but some of the values include the value that if we work together, we will create a better world, not one that's less bad than it could be, but actually better than the world that we've experienced recently. And that's one of the key important values, and there are others. But possibly most important of all, there are 2 actions that need to be taken or formulated as part of the learning. An action that's taken as an individual and an action that's taken as part of a wider group. So the individual action is an action over which you have control and you don't need anybody else's permission to do that action. If the learning takes place in a workplace, that action will normally be in the workplace, something within that individual's job, whatever job that is. And then an action as part of a wider group might be the wider organization, or in a community setting, it might be the street or the parish or the sports club. And if it's within an educational establishment, it will be within the school, college or university. People that successfully complete this day's worth of learning and evidence that, send evidence to us, and that's done as part of the organization to which they belong. And if they pass, they receive a certificate, which looks remarkably like the one on screen, to say that they are carbon literate as an individual. And that certificate is individually numbered, it's permanent, and it forms part of their portfolio of skills. The project delivers no training. We're not a training company, and we don't deliver any carbon literacy training ourselves. Instead, Each organization or audience devises their own training, or they work with an organization like them that already has. And a whole ecosystem of training organizations and trainers and communities and organizations engaged in carbon literacy sprung up across the UK, into Europe and elsewhere in the world. We review the evidence that's submitted back to us by the organizations that and groups that run the training. We make that judgment and award the certificates. And as a result, a certification pathway is developed. So the certification for individuals who become carbon literate. Because we were asked to by trainers, there's actually a professional certification scheme for facilitators, trainers and consultants. It's absolutely not compulsory. 90% of trainers delivering carbon literacy to other citizens are not certified through our scheme, and they don't need to be. That's fine. This is a scheme for trainers professionally, usually within organizations, so they have a badge and an accreditation to show that they have experience and expertise delivering carbon literacy. Organizations then came to us and said, well, we've got loads of people who are carbon literate. Are we a carbon literate organization? So we developed an accreditation scheme for organizations culturally. From bronze, silver, gold to platinum. Bronze is deliberately really easy for organizations to engage with. Platinum is really complex. You need more than 90% of your workforce to be carbon literate and be acting as an ambassador within your sector for carbon literacy. But we do have 4 platinum organizations. But organizations can show that badge to say, you know what, we get it on climate change and the emergency, and showcase the work that they're doing. And lastly, there's an accreditation for organizations that deliver training in bulk within a sector or 2 other organizations. So what's the scale of this thing? It works with everyone who lives, works and studies. It's one of the things that makes carbon literacy as a project unique, that it engages with all sectors of society. We were told at the beginning that that was a ridiculous level of ambition, and it is. But oddly, it's one of the things that makes us unique, because that's extremely hard, but it also conveys certain benefits. So it's hard work, but we work with communities, and there are logos here of community organizations, some of which you will know, many of which you won't. But this works with citizens at a citizen level. It works with citizens through organizations where, for example, they live. So these are logos you probably won't recognize, are the social housing providers, 20 of them within Greater Manchester. Carbon literacy is very much about collaborative working. We brought together 20 housing associations, all of whom put a tiny amount of money in a pot, then created 5 training courses for themselves for people who work in social housing, and a train the trainer scheme. They then trained 50 trainers, and those 50 trainers then cascaded carbon literacy across the 20 organizations and trained hundreds and then thousands of people within those organizations. That collaborative model is now extended to all sorts of sectors and organizations across the UK. So the same social housing sector model we started working last year in Wales. We have 27 housing associations in Wales. They have their own consortium. They're right in the middle of doing a big train the trainer program. We're training 74 trainers to roll carbon literacy out within social housing, the length and breadth of Wales. We work in education, so we work in schools and universities. In Scotland, there is a national target to have 50% of Scottish secondary schools with at least one class that leave school carbon literate. So this year, 5,000 pupils and teachers are studying carbon literacy as part of their national syllabus. And the hope is, if that works as successfully as the pilot schemes did, we'll get to do the other 50% next year. But it's a cascade showing carbon literacy cascading out within school children, going on and leaving school into the world of work, and therefore an extension of low carbon culture. We work with councils, the length and breadth of the UK, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We work in the health service, and we've been piloting carbon literacy in numbers of areas of the health service. We work with universities, and we're working with universities across the UK, Europe, and actually a number of business schools internationally. And we work with organisations that you will have heard of that are huge employers within the commercial sector. So SMEs right up to mega corporates. And you'll recognise down, perhaps bottom left there, the logo of Manchester Museum, which we'll come back to in a second. Most importantly, this year for us, we were approached by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, the government department responsible for our policy on climate change. And having seen this collaborative working model work across the UK in different sectors, they approached us with some funding and said, could we oversee, curate the production of carbon literacy materials for national rollout into 5 different areas of public sector. So we started this project in October last year, and working with BEIS themselves as a sample government department, so that if they roll out successfully within government department staff in BEIS, the training will be made available to other government departments. We're working with local government across the UK, and on Tuesday this week launched that course live, and that course is now available free of charge to all local government, all local councils across the UK. We're working with NHS, we're working with universities, and working with emergency services, which is where all those logos came from before now. So what does that actually mean in terms of numbers? So far, 15,000 citizens have been through this carbon literacy process. Because it will take 2 actions, way more than 30,000 actions have been pledged. 40 organisations are now culturally carbon literate and have accredited through that scheme. But over 1,200 organisations now have staff that are carbon literate and are increasing those numbers. 159 different carbon literacy courses. So when I said carbon literacy isn't a course and we're not a training company, there are 159 different solutions to the question, what is a carbon literacy course? And lots of other numbers. And importantly, external research has established that there are between 5 and 15% carbon savings per person that goes through a process like this. So what? You might say to me, Dave, of course you would say this, of course you're going to enthuse about the project. You're the MD, but if I can just stop screen sharing for a moment. You might well say, well, you'd enthuse about it, you're the managing director. So I'd rather you not hear it all from me, I'd rather you hear something from someone who actually works in your sector. So I'd like to introduce Lynsey Jones, who's the Museum Development Officer for Manchester Museum and the Northwest Museum Development Network. So over to Lynsey.
Thank you very much, Dave, and good morning, everybody. And thank you to Southwest Fed for inviting Dave and I along to talk this morning. So I am Lynsey Jones, I'm Museum Development Officer for Museum Development Northwest, which, as the name suggests, is the Northwest England equivalent of your Southwest Museum Development Programme. We've been around since 2012, and we inherited a Green Museums programme from our predecessor, which was Renaissance Northwest. And actually, in a former job, I was one of the delegates on the first Green Museums programme that ran in 2010. And the focus of it was what Dave's referred to previously as sort of within the fence line. The focus was on reducing your electricity bills and saving carbon and financial costs. And it was a very successful programme. In the year that I did it, the 20 museums that took part, we collectively saved about £280,000 just by reducing our electricity bills. But having run it over a number of years, we realised that there was one quite big problem with this programme, because it took just one person from each museum through it. So if that person left, even if they had built up a team of colleagues around them who were helping them with the green mission, as soon as that person, that driver left, all the work tended to just fall off a cliff overnight, to be honest. So at the end of 2015, we were looking around for a solution to this, looking for something that would address this whilst keeping all the other good elements of the programme. And we are based at Manchester Museum, which is part of Manchester University. And at the same time, our colleagues at Manchester Museum were planning their big summer exhibition for 2016, which was called Climate Control. And this was going to be the first time that the museum had had direct conversations with their visitors about climate change. And the head of collections, as part of this prep for the exhibition, had heard about this carbon literacy project that was developing in Manchester. They'd had a couple of conversations with them, and an email went out around all the staff saying they're running a train the trainer course for the social housing sector, and it's just a few buildings down Oxford Road from us, and they've got 2 spare places. I'll fund the places. Does anybody want to go? And I put my hand up and went, yeah, not doing anything those days. I'll just go along, see what it's like. And that's how we started working with carbon literacy, because we saw in this a solution to the problem that we had. Because carbon literacy, it's very democratic and it's very equitable, because everybody can take part in the course. All of your staff, it doesn't matter where they sit in the staff structure, your volunteers, your boards, your counsellors, your friends. We have had all sorts of people going through our training. And we always say, sustainability isn't in anybody's job title, but it's in everybody's role. And some of the best conversations we've had in the training is where, for example, you've had a cleaner sat next to the senior manager of the same museum, because chances are in their daily activities that their two paths just don't cross. Your cleaners will know all the bad practices that go on in your museum, but don't have the power to do anything about it individually. Your senior managers are probably very unlikely to know that these things are even an issue. And sometimes they can be the real small, nuanced things. So if it's your local authority environmental health policy to change all the plastic bin bags in every single bin in your building every single day, even if there's just a single apple core in one, if you multiply every day, every week, every month, suddenly you've got a huge plastic problem that you probably didn't even know was there. By putting together the person with the knowledge and the person who has the power to enable change, that's when you start seeing things happen. And also, a lot of people have a natural interest in the environment generally outside of their job. So carbon literacy harnesses that interest that you have by giving them permission to bring that interest into the workplace, even though it's not, that's what their job is ostensibly to do, and giving them permission to come up with the ideas and to get involved in something that they are interested in and that they value. So that's a huge benefit that we found with carbon literacy. So the two places that were taken up, I took up one on the social housing course, and the other member of staff who took up the second place was the head of commercial operations at the museum. And if you think about this, you know, his job is to maximise income from retail and events, and that doesn't always sit well and compatibly with sustainability. So we were quite an interesting mix to be looking at this. And we took that social housing content and we adapted it for museums. So we took out the stuff that was specific to social housing and we put in lots of museum content. We made it very specific to museums. And at the same time as Manchester Museum was running the climate control exhibition with its visitors so that we could practice what we preached, we were running carbon literacy training behind the scenes to all the staff. So throughout the course of that summer, we trained up 86 delegates who all became carbon literate. We were a little surprised because there are only 70 staff at the museum, but we had some volunteers came along too, and also because we are on Manchester University's campus, word started to get out that this was what we were doing, and people from other departments booked themselves on, and if they turned up, we trained them. We trained everybody who came. As a result, Manchester Museum became one of the very first carbon literate organisations when the scheme was launched, and we were also the very first carbon literate museum. Having piloted it all with Manchester Museum, we then took the training, we adapted it again to make it suitable for all sizes of museums, all types of museums, and we inserted it into our Museum Development Northwest open training programme, our normal workshop programme. And like all the other workshops that we run, delegates benefit by picking up ideas from other delegates on the course. And as somebody pointed out, this isn't copying, this is recycling. So it's very sustainable. So we have had over 300 people trained to date. They are from the smallest independent museums, multi-site local authority museums, national museums. We have had heritage railways go through the course, trying to address the fact that they have to use coal in order to run their engines. We have had art galleries go through it where they have a lot of loans out, so that their air miles travelling around, their paintings travelling around the world are quite high. So whatever your circumstances, whatever your issues that you have around sustainability, it provides a starting point for you to start thinking about it and to have discussions about it. So as our open training, we were commissioned by the Northwest Bridge organisation to deliver it to their staff. We have put some national Arts Council England and Museum Development staff through it too. Last year, West Midlands Museum Development commissioned us to go down to Shrewsbury to run it for some of their museums. You may be aware that Dippy the dinosaur, who normally sits at the Natural History Museum, is currently on a nationwide tour, and at the moment he's in Rochdale. He should have left in June, but because of the coronavirus, he's been self-isolating for the last 6 months, but is now back open to the public. It was a 4-year project to get Dippy to Rochdale, and as part of the planning for that, we went in and we delivered the carbon literacy training to the staff at Link for Life, which is the independent trust, and Rochdale Borough Council, who are involved in bringing Dippy to Rochdale. And what they are going to do once Dippy moves on to his next venue, as a legacy of that project, is to then deliver the carbon literacy training to all the voluntary groups, to all the community groups that have been involved in the Dippy project. So it provides a legacy to that. Excuse me. We also have a network of trainers all around the Northwest. So actually, whilst I might have delivered probably the first 10 or 12 workshops in the Northwest, I haven't run anything for a while, because we have the trainers who are spread out across the region. They all have the basic material, which is all criteria checked and certified by the Carbon Literacy Trust, but they are then able to take it and use it for their own purposes. So we have a trainer at Wordsworth Trust in Grasmere in the Lake District. And to begin with, she rolled it out to all of her colleagues, but then she and her colleagues broke down the training into, I think, 4 separate sessions, and went into their local primary school and delivered that to all of the pupils there. And then the pupils then took it and they went into the village hall and they delivered it to the Grasmere residents. So it had that cascading effect. We also do some sort of specific interventions as well. So as well as the Dippy in Rochdale, we have Port Sunlight Village Trust. It's a beautiful model village in the Wirral. And the museum staff, it's quite a small museum, but the museum staff have a very wide remit, because they are also responsible for all the heritage buildings and all the conservation across the whole of the village. So we have just trained up some of their staff to become carbon literate trainers, and what they want to do is become the first carbon literate village, training up all the residents, everybody who works there, anybody who's got any association with Port Sunlight, and that forms a part of their conservation management plan for the whole village. We had a member of staff from an independent trust come to just one of our normal open training programs. She works for a community and leisure trust which has 2 museums within it, but has a much wider portfolio. And she did the training, and then she emailed us 2 days later to say, I've been to talk to the chief executive and he's agreed that we can roll this out across all 40 buildings that the trust manages. So it all has, it's started from MDNW, but it all has this ripple effect. And like Dave was saying, because it's peer-to-peer and it's localized, you adapt it for what you need it to do. So why are we doing carbon literacy training, and why are we doing it in the way that we are doing it? Well, the world is very different now from it was 10 years ago when I did my first Green Museums programme. You know, the emphasis then was very much on reduce your electricity bill, you know, reduce your carbon footprint, you know, change your electricity supplier, switch on the lights in the morning much later than they are being now. But things have changed and we can't just remember to switch off a few light bulbs occasionally. There is a climate emergency now, which requires much quicker, much harder actions. And we are museums. You know, we represent the world, whether we are natural history collections, whether we are social history collections. You know, we tell the story of the evolution of the world, whether that is animals having to adapt to survive, whether it is about, you know, the impact of the Industrial Revolution, which started here. That evolution hasn't stopped. And so we have to carry on telling that story, but also we have to acknowledge that we are part of that story too. And also our visitors are concerned about climate change now. I never dreamt that when we started working with carbon literacy that, you know, school children in their thousands and around the world would be prepared to miss some of their schooling in order to go on climate strikes to make their voices heard about their concerns. Greta Thunberg gave a speech last year, and she said, "The bigger your carbon footprint, the bigger your moral duty. The bigger your platform, the bigger your responsibility." And on both counts, UK museums can't ignore the climate emergency. So Dave has mentioned sort of the level of agency we have, you know, the level of influence. And museums do have a lot, and individuals within museums have a lot too. So the individual pledge that you make as part of your carbon literacy one-day workshop, it's what can you do right now that you don't need permission from anybody else, that you don't need to refer to anybody else to, what's in your power to do. And obviously the scale of it will be completely different from, you know, going back to what the cleaner can do, what the senior manager can do, but everybody can do something right now and make a significant difference by you. And that's just you as an individual. Put us all together within our museums and we can do a lot. Put us together as a sector and we can do even more. So there's the individual, there is what the museum can do, but it's using our assets. So yes, definitely there's the back of house stuff, there's making effective use of our buildings, there's reducing our carbon footprint. All of that is still important and it's still vital that we use the resources that we have effectively. But also we have other assets too. Museums are still trusted, and actually we are becoming one of the few public organisations that is still retaining public trust. So we need to use that, and we are here to represent and to talk to our communities. And I am going to disagree with Dave on one point about polar bears. Because if you have a polar bear in your collection, then use it. Because museums, in communicating what is, you know, climate change is quite a scary topic, and it's a big topic, and it can be an overwhelming topic. But museums have the wow factor to be able to do that. We can inspire, and absolutely no offence to the housing sector, but they can't make their carbon literacy workshop involving polar bears. Whereas we can, you know, we can provide that inspiration. We can communicate what is a really very difficult message in a way that talks to people. And we are there for our communities, and we have to represent our communities as well. You know, we have to talk to them, and you know, that's our role. But also as a sector as well, we can be very influential. But also I think as a sector, there are a lot more questions that we need to ask ourselves too. It's probably about 12 years ago since the Bezo Declaration was published, which intended to address sort of the environmental concerns around the very strict loan standards that we have within the sector. Has that really been adopted? I don't think it has, definitely not consistently across the sector. So there are still questions that we need to ask of ourselves too. And I said that the world looks very different from it did 10 years ago. And actually in the last 6 months, it has looked unrecognisable. We haven't run any carbon literacy workshops during the pandemic, partly because we have to move it online, which is completely new for us, and we want to do a good job of it. Also partly because the content needs to be changed. We do review our course every 6 months just to make sure that things like all the statistics are up to date, but also the course has evolved over the last 3 or 4 years as well. When we started it, we would talk about single-use plastics because it just wasn't on anybody's radar. And now we don't need to do that because that's just mainstream. But also it needs a much bigger change this time around before we can rerun it, because sustainability is sometimes referred to as the triple bottom line. So environmental, economic and social sustainability. It's about inequalities and it's about creating a just world, because people who are least responsible for climate change are always the most affected by it, whether you're talking about different parts of the world or whether you're talking about within your own region, within your own locality. And what's happened in the last 6 months has just highlighted those inequalities. You know, homeschooling was based on the assumption that all households have access to the internet, and they don't, and that all children have access to a laptop and a tablet, and they don't. You know, it took a footballer rather than a politician to raise the issue of children going hungry. And Black Lives Matters as well has highlighted it's not just historic inequalities, but current injustices that we have to address too. And all of this is the context within which carbon literacy sits, and within which that day-long workshop sits, and within which your actions sit. So in some respects, that day-long workshop isn't the important bit. It's what you do after that really counts. And that's the bigger picture within which everything sits. But to talk really as close to home as we can get, museums are in a real perilous situation right now because of coronavirus. Our incomes have disappeared. Most of our visitors have disappeared. If we as individual museums and if we as a sector are to come out through the other side of this, then what we have to do is make effective use of the resources that we have, but also we have to be seen to be making effective use of them too. And we have to listen to, and we have to be there to, and we have to respond to our audiences and our communities. And whatever we do, we have to make a difference. And I don't think that we can afford to not do that. And carbon literacy, it may be a day's workshop, but it's the starting point to bring your museum together, to bring the sector together, for us to make those changes that we are going to have to make, and we now have to make quite rapidly. So I will bring Dave back in, see if there's anything that he wants to add to that, and I will just stop sharing.
Thanks very much for that, Lynsey. So to wrap up the kind of formal presentee part of this piece, I started out by talking about the basics and the things that organisations could do within the fence line and then outside the fence line and then culture. And I know that you know this, but Lynsey has given some really good examples of one particular institution doing things in the fence line and then absolutely taking it outside the fence line and far, far beyond the fence line. It was, I think, for World Environment Day, Lynsey will correct me if I've got that wrong, the museum set up, or sorry, the Museum Development Network Northwest set up a scheme where there wasn't an institution, an arts-based institution in the UK, more than, I think it was 50 miles from a free carbon literacy training course for staff, so that more cultural organisations could get engaged in that. And that was done by and funded by Museum Development Northwest. So the possibilities with this are literally endless. We've shown you a little bit about what a cultural institution can do. I hope you've found some interest and hopefully a small amount of inspiration from the things you've seen this morning. But for the moment, I think we should shut up and hand back to Claire, because I think there are probably some questions and answers. But thank you very much for your interest and for your attention.
Thank you both. That was a really great way to start the day, and some really fascinating insights, and there are some questions popping up. I think it was really useful just to have us reminded about our own circles of influence and the impact that we can have as individuals. But I did just want to ask each of you what stands out as maybe the most positive step change that you've seen as a result of this project. Dave, maybe you could go first.
I will give you a very specific one. I said about it's an anecdote, sorry, it's going to take 2 minutes, but hopefully it'll be worth it when we get to the end. I said there were 2 actions that came out of climate change. Action as an individual, action as part of a wider organisation. The individual action should be in the context that the training takes place. So within the museum, it would be something the museum does. So one of the organisations we engaged with was ITV, and BAFTA and other a particular team that engaged with us was the Coronation Street production team. So they did carbon literacy training. So we challenged them at the time. So your individual action needs to be, within the context. What do? You make soap operas. Let's, to use the Manchester expression, let's have carbon literacy on the cobbles of Corrie, was I think the challenge. And the writers that we were talking to at the time kind of looked at us very fixedly and said, yeah, we'll have a think about that. And we thought, okay, probably been a bit too cheeky there, but hey, it was worth a try. Then about 3 months later, someone pinged us and said, just watch the plot of Coronation Street tonight. So we tuned in. I don't watch Coronation Street regularly, but, and there's a particular character, Sally, who you may know, Sally Metcalf. She's the battle axe character that argues with every other character all the time. That's just her character. And she and her husband, Tim, came into the front room of their house at the start of this scene. And she said, darling, we don't talk enough anymore. We should talk more. He says, oh, come on, love, what do you want to talk about? And she said, climate change. Did you know it's real and it's happening? And 97% of scientists agree that we're responsible because of our use of fossil fuels. Oh, come on, love, do you want to talk about this now? Yes, I do, Tim, because it's very important and we all need to do our bit. And they then had a 3-minute Barney, basically, in the front room of their house, with her talking about climate change and disclosing all sorts of useful information about the science and the things that people could do. And him saying, oh, but you just don't take it seriously. You won't even go on a bus, love. And then because it was Coronation Street, it ended up in a huge row. She invoked a sex ban and said, nothing's going to happen in the bedroom unless we have a proper conversation about climate change. Stormed out and slammed the door. So it was total Coronation Street pantomime. And the messages that she disclosed, and they disclosed in the conversation, went out to 8 million viewers who saw that particular episode. So it's an example of a cultural organisation using its level of agency to take that message and use the tools that are at hand and absolutely broadcast it to a wider audience. And if you watch Coronation Street regularly, you'll now see there are climate change messages throughout. Recycling, somebody up a ladder in the cafe changing the light bulbs to LEDs because they're going to save me a fortune, these, and they're going to help us save the planet. And it's now inextricably woven into the plot of Coronation Street and EastEnders and Emmerdale, because the production teams that worked on this have all done carbon literacy. So it's a good example of a step change. We don't expect every action to be at that scale because not everyone has that level of agency, but there are other examples at that scale, and it's, I think, a really good example.
Thank you. Lynsey, can I ask you?
I don't think I can top that answer. But I have 2 things. One is working with the Dippy project and the team in Rochdale, because, to be perfectly honest, it's been so much fun to do. It's climate change is a very serious topic to address, and it's a very emotional one to do. But what we've been doing with Dippy, you know, occasionally sometimes you just pinch yourself and go, I get paid to do this. It's been a very, very fun way of doing it, and the reaction that we've had to it has been great. But my serious answer, I suppose, is what's been the standout for me is realizing that I am not central to it anymore, because, you know, I haven't run a workshop for a while because we have this team of trainers who are doing them. And, you know, it was the team at Dippy who came to us to say, we had approached them originally to say, one of your themes is sustainability, you know, would you like us to do something with carbon literacy around that? But it was originally going to be just we train up the people who are involved at Stones Rochdale and the council. It was their idea to extend it throughout the project and to the community groups. It was Port Sunlight who approached us to say, we want to do it village-wide. So it's seeing that ripple effect happen has been the most satisfying thing about it. Because like the Green Museums, it's not reliant on me, and it's not reliant on Museum Development North West anymore.
Thank you. We've got some specific questions coming through about how to access the training, the sort of costs involved, and whether it's a sort of delivered as a bespoke thing or if it's a sort of generic package. That, you know, whether you sort of tailor it to the different types of organisations that are doing it. I don't know how much detail you want to go in at this point, or whether there's a place you can point people to find out that kind of information.
I'll cover the place you can go to, because I have one more slide, which right at the end, where if you warn me as we were reaching the end of the Q&A, Claire, I'll share one slide which just has the details of where to find out more about the project. So it's basically our website, carbonliteracy.com. I noticed a question earlier asking about price, so I'll quickly romp through that. Is there a cost? Yes, there is. The Carbon Literacy Project is a charity, so one of the ways that we fund ourselves is by earning a small amount of income from doing this work. It costs £10 per person to become carbon literate, and that's because the evidence is submitted to us. We manually review all of that evidence, make a judgment as to whether the person's carbon literate, create a certificate, send it out, and then maintain the records of all of that, because it's part of people's skills portfolios. And there is a cost to accrediting a course. For museums and not-for-profit organisations, it's relatively small. It's a matter of a few £100s. If it's a tiny community group that haven't got any funding, effectively it's free. If you're a large mega corporate, clearly it's a bit more expensive, and there's a tiered pricing scheme. But the prices for everything are transparent and available as a price list on the website. A number of people have said, is there any way of accessing free training, or how could we do this? We accredit training, we don't actually deliver it. So there are two ways more than that, but there are two basic ways of accessing training. One is to create a training course from scratch yourself as an organisation. We provide loads of free resources, including a kit that you can use to build a course, and all of that's free of charge. The only thing we charge for is the accreditation of that course. You submit your draft course to us, and we review it for quality reasons and say, yep, that will do, you need to change that bit, and that's how we do the accreditation. But we even help you through that process. There is a cost for that. The process is called criteria checking. That was the term that Lynsey dropped in when she was speaking. But if you are part of a network of people that already have courses that are appropriate for your sector and your type of organisation, you may be able to access materials for free. And there is this whole ecosystem in different sectors of people and organisations that have funded a course and are then willing to share it with others for free. So I'm making no assumptions about what might be possible within the museum sector. That's for others to do. But that was the way that social housing worked, that a small number, but a tiny amount of money, put £2,000 each in a pot, and then created 5 different courses, a train the trainer course, a piece of e-learning, a secretariat to administer it all, and then roll it out. And we've seen that model work very well in other sectors. And that's how lots of people can access courses customized for their sector, entirely appropriate for them, potentially free of charge. But each one we'd need to look at on a case-by-case basis. You remember I said on that slide there, I think it was 159 we're up to. Are the courses customized? Yep, 159 different customized solutions for different types of people and organizations and sectors. So there are as many answers to what is carbon literacy as there are organizations.
Thank you. And would you say there have been any specific challenges in terms of delivering this to museum professionals specifically? I don't know who's best placed to answer that.
Lynsey.
I wouldn't call them challenges, that are things to bear in mind. Obviously, when the first time we delivered the workshops, it was to Manchester Museum, it was to lots of people from one museum. When we then put it into our regional training programme, you'd have one or two people from lots of different museums in the workshop. So you get a slightly different dynamic to that. And also because we take on anybody and everybody who signs up. You know, I'm not an environmental climate change specialist. Sometimes it's a little, not intimidating for the workshop facilitator, but sometimes there are people on the workshop who have far more scientific knowledge of the subject than I do. So it's a, there is such a mix. And, you know, I've probably run about 20 workshops and I haven't had two that are anywhere the same. So you're working with a different mix of delegates with different knowledge levels. You also, in the case of Manchester Museum, where it was everybody will go through it, you have some people who are a little bit more sceptical than those who are enthusiastic, so you have to manage that. And also, I suppose the main challenge is the material is quite emotional. Last year we ran the course based around a documentary called Before the Flood, which it just so happened, it's presented by an actor, I don't know if you've heard of him, called Leonardo DiCaprio, and he filmed this just before the 2016 presidential election, and it just so happened to cover everything that we were covering in the science element of what is climate change in the morning part of our session. So it was great to use it because it actually took a little bit of pressure off the presenters because we weren't talking all the time. But also it's quite a hard-hitting documentary. It's quite stark, and I suppose that story does need to be told in that way of what will happen if we don't make changes. But also you have to say to the delegates, this is going to be quite emotional. If you do need to leave the room and just take 5 minutes, go and do that. But quite often my co-presenter, I will hear her sniffing at various points of the documentary where she is moved. So it's quite a difficult subject matter sometimes that has to be broken down, and it's a difficult subject matter normally, but I think in these last 6 months where everybody's been on an emotional roller coaster about everything that is going on, I think that is something that you have to be very, very conscious of dealing with, acknowledging and harnessing that.
Can I chip in there, Lynsey? I deliberately chose not to go through the detail of what was in the carbon literacy standard, and I just said there were those areas. So one of them is values. And one of the values that we need to see addressed in the materials is the emotional content of actually engaging properly with climate change. It's very easy to kind of shy away from it, think, oh, I can't go there, it's just too dark. But then we're probably not engaging deeply enough at the level we need to realize just how serious it is. But we also need to cater for the fact that some delegates will potentially, if it's done correctly, find it upsetting because it is upsetting and it is really serious. So most trainers that have tried to or have run the course as a single day are familiar with the 11 o'clock slump, which is you do all the science first thing, and by 11 o'clock, everybody's about to jump from the nearest tall building as you realize, oh my God, this is dreadful. We're doomed. We're all dreadful people. What are we going to do? And it reaches the first break and the trainer says, don't panic, have a coffee, go away, come back. And after break, we'll talk about the things we can do to fix it because we can fix it. And everybody goes, okay. Then they come back after lunch. And then by the end of the day, we'll come out and say, I was really scared and frightened about all of this, but now I realize how much we can do and I can see what I can do. I'm committed to do my bit. Now I feel inspired, and you know what? I'm going to do more. So the best way to engage with the difficult side is by empowerment. And if we can leave people empowered to do more, it leaves them in a better place than even if they didn't know anything about this, much less we're dealing with the more challenging aspects of it.
Thank you.
So I can just add to that. Yes, my script mid-morning is abbreviated as the helpless and hopeless section, because you do go through that and then you pick up the delegates. So it is a bit of an emotional roller coaster, but as Dave says, because of the material, because of the gravity, because of the scale of it, you do have to go through that, I think.
Yeah.
For it to
Okay.
be.
Thank you. There's a question which hopefully we quite quick to answer, which is just whether there are any examples of museums in the Southwest that have undertaken the training and how the word is being spread in our region. Dave, maybe you're able to tell us what the kind of geographical spread of this is across the UK?
At the moment, it's still mainly north of London and in the north of England, and particularly in Scotland, and actually quite a lot going on in Wales, but very little going on in the Southwest. And actually, one of the reasons I took this invitation was because I was saying to colleagues, we aren't doing anything in the Southwest. What's going on down there? So I'm not aware yet of any cultural institutions or other organisations. I know one or two others privately, but they're relatively small. Lynsey might know some that I don't know about, because obviously she knows the sector far better than I do.
No, as far as I'm aware, no museums in the Southwest have become carbon literate yet.
I think that's interesting in itself. So I think that's something that we can pick up on.
I think it's a fantastic opportunity for the Southwest Federation.
Thank you. There's two more questions which hopefully we'll be able to get through before we get to 1:15. One was around whether you see differences in terms of actions after training between individuals and organisations, and whether people do actually do their pledges or do more, what the kind of, I suppose it's that post-event evaluation and sort of how that plays out.
Yeah, so lots of people say, how do you know everybody does exactly what they pledge to do? And the answer is we don't, and we know that, and we say that to people up front. If you're carbon literate, when you leave the course, that's the end of that process. What you do with your carbon literacy is up to you. It's a bit like, take the carbon out, literacy. We teach kids to read and write. We don't wait till they write a novel before we say that they can read and write and they leave school. What they write is up to them. Might be another novel, might be a shopping list, doesn't really matter. So we don't try and track in that way. However, in the evidence that comes back to us, people evidence what it is often that they've already done. So we can see their level of engagement. And then we get reports back from organizations as to the impacts of their carbon literate people and things that have happened as a consequence. So both anecdotally and in terms of university research that's been done into carbon literacy, which is available on our website, we know that people will respond and usually deliver more action than they actually pledged to originally. We ask for 2 actions. It's quite common to get 4 or 5 on the initial form with people coming back saying, this is what I'm going to do based on what I've seen today.
Okay, no, that's useful, thank you. And the last question is for Lynsey, which is really just acknowledging what you were saying towards the end of your presentation and looking at those much wider issues in terms of sort of community reach and making sure that you are representing your communities and really just acknowledging that kind of maybe some of what you're doing and some of the direction you're moving in is taking more of a political position, and whether you're finding yourself supported in that, or whether that is sometimes you're encountering barriers to that, particularly in terms of your stakeholders. The question mentions trustees, but I don't know if your stakeholders are probably your funders and sort of how you're finding that, especially bearing in mind the climate that we're in as a sector as well.
I'll break that up into sort of, we're not experiencing any barriers as a museum development programme. And we have a slightly different model from the Southwest Museum Development in that we are 100% funded by Arts Council. And so they are very encouraging of us and of what we are doing. And so too is our host museum, Manchester Museum and University of Manchester, in that we are making environmental sustainability one of the key areas in which we work. But we do know of the museums that come to our training, they do have barriers around trustees who may not see who may see the economic benefit of, say, reducing your carbon footprint. So again, remaining within the fence line, as Dave described it, but who may not see, either because of the subject matter of the museum or where they sit in their local community, you know, may not see the immediate wider relevance of how climate change affects the museum and what role that museum might be able to have in addressing it. So yes, two different things there. We are being very encouraging in what we are doing, but we know that museums sometimes are encountering those barriers and those challenges.
And just so that if people want to know more, the best place to go is the Carbon Literacy Project website, which is www.carbonliteracy.com. It's as simple as that. And there are paths that you can follow as organisations or individuals or communities that will explain lots more.
I will leave the Q&A there. Thank you so much to both of you for taking time to answer some tough questions. So that was good. And thank you to those who were submitting questions. There was also a lot going on the chat, which is great. So we will